If you could pack all of human history into 1 year, we've only been farming and eating grain since about yesterday, which is when we became shorter and fatter. We only started consuming processed vegetable oils about 10 minutes ago, which is when heart disease became our #1 killer. So after examining all this human history, the experts came to the obvious conclusion. We need to eat a lot more of these. And so they convinced us that human health depends on foods we didn't eat for more than 99% of our entire existence. How did this happen? In the 1950s, a biochemist named Ancel Keys published a study that compared heart disease and fat consumption in a half-dozen countries. The more fat, the more heart disease. The trend line was unmistakable. Just one little problem. Keys left out countries where people eat a lot of fat but have very little heart disease, like Holland and Norway. He also left out countries where people don't eat much fat but do have a lot of heart disease, like Chile. In fact, Keys had reliable data from 22 countries, and the results were all over the place. But you can't make a big splash in the scientific community with a trend line that looks like this. So Keys did what any dedicated researcher would do. He threw out the data that didn't fit and published his results. His punishment for this bit of scientific chicanery was to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Keys became known as the father of the lipid hypothesis, which says that eating saturated fat raises the cholesterol in your blood, and high cholesterol in your blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease.
The hypothesis that when you eat high fat, that produces high cholesterol, and the cholesterol produces heart disease, is wrong in every one of those links.
This whole idea that dietary fat causes cholesterol problems is sort of a myth. The whole idea that cholesterol problems lead to heart disease is a myth.
The theory is completely and totally wrong. It was a theory that was made out of whole cloth and then pushed.
The term artery clogging saturated fat, it's as though it's all one word.
It's become part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows saturated fat is bad for you, but when you get back and you start looking at the medical literature and you root back through to find out where this whole idea came from, it's bogus.
3 authors who did root through the medical literature are science writer Gary Taubes, Swedish Dr. Uffe Ravenskov, and British Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. When they examined the data from all the big studies on heart disease, they discovered some pretty interesting facts. Here's my favorite. Guess how many studies actually prove that a high-fat diet causes heart disease? The answer? 0. That's right, none. In some of the largest studies ever conducted, researchers put thousands of volunteers on a low-fat diet and then tracked their health history for several years. The results? Nothing. They had just as many heart attacks as people who weren't on a low-fat diet. Since 1948, the Harvard Medical School has been following the diets and death rates of the entire population of Framingham, Massachusetts. One of the researchers involved in the Framingham study called the lipid hypothesis the greatest scientific scam of this century, perhaps of any century. And after more than 40 years, even the director of the study made a rather startling admission about what the study data actually shows. The more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol. In other words, a high-fat diet does not automatically raise your cholesterol. Well, what about the second half of the lipid hypothesis? Whether it comes from your diet or not, doesn't high cholesterol cause heart disease? After all, that's what the experts have been telling us for 50 years.
Lots of people have bad heart attacks and have low cholesterol. There's not really a huge correlation there.
You've got people who have heart attacks and who develop plaque who have high cholesterol, people who have low cholesterol. There's really not any correlation.
Michael DeBakey, the famous heart surgeon, compared the medical records of more than 1,700 of his own patients. He found no relationship between cholesterol levels and heart disease. When Dwight Eisenhower had his first heart attack, his cholesterol was only about 165. Wow, that's a nice healthy level there, General. So if high cholesterol doesn't actually cause heart disease, what does?
The newest theories in heart disease development don't have anything to do with cholesterol. They have to do with inflammation.
Cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Cholesterol is the thing that heart disease acts upon. The heart disease is the inflammation and the oxidation, the plaquing out of cholesterol once it becomes oxidized.
So many people have been found that have low, normal or low cholesterol, and they still have bad heart disease. But most of those people, when they're checked carefully, will have signs of inflammation.
To understand how inflammation can cause heart disease, let's look at what cholesterol actually does. Cholesterol is one of the most important substances in your body. Without it, you'd be dead. Your brain and your nervous system are full of cholesterol. The walls of your cells depend on cholesterol. Nearly all of your hormones are made from cholesterol. This stuff is so important, almost every cell in your body can make its own cholesterol if it has to. The heart disease story we all know goes like this. If you have too much LDL or bad cholesterol, it builds up in your arteries and makes them narrow. But if you're lucky, HDL or good cholesterol gobbles it up and clears it away. It's a nice, simple story. And it's a load of baloney. For one thing, LDL and HDL are not cholesterol. They're proteins that carry cholesterol through your blood. LDL carries cholesterol from your liver to your tissues, and HDL carries old cholesterol back to your liver where it's recycled. If you want more HDL, the last thing you need is a low-fat diet.
What makes HDL go up? Fat in the diet. That's what raises HDL. So you increase the fat in your diet, and your HDL, deemed by even the most fervent anti-cholesterol person as the good cholesterol, HDL goes up.
That's right. In spite of what the experts told us, 27 different studies have shown that eating saturated fat raises your HDL. And despite its bad reputation, not all LDL is actually bad.
LDL comes in different size packages. There are little small, dense, BB-like packages, and there are big, round, fluffy, cotton ball-like packages. And the small, dense ones, it turns out, what's called the type B LDL, are the most harmful ones. And the big fluffy ones aren't particularly harmful at all.
Heart disease doesn't begin when your cholesterol goes up. It begins when your arteries become damaged or inflamed. LDL then does exactly what it's supposed to do. It brings in cholesterol to help the healing process. But if small LDL becomes damaged by oxidation, it can penetrate the wall of the artery. If the inflammation and oxidation continue, a plaque begins to form. Now you've got heart disease. So does a high-fat diet produce too much small LDL? Nope. Small LDL is the result of eating too many carbohydrates.
That's been shown in the medical literature probably a dozen times at least in papers that reducing carbohydrate in the diet shifts from a small dense pattern to a big fluffy pattern.
Having an LDL that's 120 or 130 or 100 or 145 doesn't matter as much as the kind of LDL that it is.
If the numbers alone don't mean very much, then why does high cholesterol get all the blame? Research consistently shows that smoking, elevated blood sugar, and emotional stress can cause inflammation, damage your arteries, and lead to heart disease. They also happen to raise your cholesterol. So by blaming cholesterol for causing heart disease, the experts relied on logic that makes about as much sense as this. In high crime areas, there are more calls to the police. Therefore, we can assume that calling the police produces an increase in crime. To get rid of crime, the answer is simple. Stop calling the police. But in spite of all the evidence that cholesterol is just an innocent bystander, the experts keep trying to bring it up on charges. In 1988, the Surgeon General's office set out to prove the lipid hypothesis by reviewing the data from all the major studies. But after 11 years and more than $100 million, the results were not supporting the theory. So they did what any dedicated government researchers would do. They shut down the entire project, saying it was becoming too complicated. And as Kendrick Taubes and Ravenscoff discovered, that's been a disturbingly common pattern. Researchers routinely ignore evidence that the lipid hypothesis is wrong and sometimes even manipulate their data for the sole purpose of supporting it. What could possibly cause such rampant dishonesty? In the 1970s, the lipid hypothesis was still very much in dispute. Then a Senate committee headed by George McGovern decided to settle the issue. McGovern at the time was following the Pritikin diet and believed everyone should be cutting back on fat and cholesterol.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol, down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day. But doctors took issue with that at the hearing, saying that 8 studies involving 5,000 patients failed to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
Let's listen to that part again.
8 studies involving 5,000 patients fail to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
You know, there were eminent scientists of the time saying this is nonsense. There is no good scientific evidence that either fat or cholesterol, is at the root of heart disease.
I said to the professor that I was working with, this is not right. Animal fat's not causing this, and this is not what the data says.
So the McGovern staff did what any dedicated staff working for McGovern would do. They decided those scientists must have been paid off by the big bad dairy and egg industries.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
They went to great lengths to overlook anything that did not fall into lockstep with that belief, and basically just unleashed what amounted to a several decade-long experiment in which all of us were unwitting participants.
The McGovern Committee's report was written by a young staff member who happened to be a vegetarian and had no background in medicine or health research. The committee recommended a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet for everyone and offered some ideas that could only spring from the mind of a politician.
But Senator Schweiker of Pennsylvania suggested that instead of discrediting the committee's report, the eggmen should be out developing hens that would lay low-cholesterol eggs.
Soon after the McGovern report was issued, the USDA got into the act. Carol Tucker Foreman, the assistant secretary at the time, believed in the low-fat diet theory and wanted to issue official guidelines to tell everybody how to eat. To make sure she was on solid scientific ground, she consulted with Philip Handler, the head of the National Academy of Sciences. Just one little problem. Handler told her the McGovern Committee's report was nonsense. So she did what any dedicated government official would do. She ignored him, shopped around for a scientist who agreed with her, then issued the guidelines. Thanks to a handful of politicians with no background in science, the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became official government policy. And real scientists got the message loud and clear. Tell us what we already believe, or you can say goodbye to your lucrative government funding.
There is influence that goes on, starting with the USDA, which is promoting commodity agriculture. So there is a lot of economic pressure on the people at NIH, on the people in the universities who carry out the studies for NIH.
They live by their grants. No grants, no work, no job.
Dr. Kilmer McCulley, a researcher at Harvard, went against the prevailing theory and published a study concluding that something other than cholesterol was causing heart disease. His reward for this bit of scientific integrity was to be denied tenure, lose all his research grants, and get shoved into a little laboratory in the basement. In academia, that's a polite way of saying you're fired. He also ended up on an unofficial blacklist, and it took him 2 years to find another job as a researcher.
A lot of people have built careers on this, and these are careers built on a very shaky factual foundation.
There's a reasonable reason to believe that from the beginning, but to persist in the face of so much overwhelming evidence really can't be based on science, and you have to think that there were other factors involved. It became an industry.
In the 1980s, the National Cholesterol Education Program released new guidelines that said everyone's cholesterol should be below 200, which was about 20 points below normal. And here's a strange coincidence. Most of the scientists who wrote those guidelines just happen to have a financial relationship with the companies that make cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins. Many of the studies that claimed a low-fat diet is good for your heart were funded by the American Heart Association, which earns millions of dollars licensing its Heart Check logo to healthy low-fat foods like Cocoa Puffs. If the lipid hypothesis ever goes away, that logo just became worthless.
Give this another decade, and that hypothesis will be on the junk pile of history because it's not true.
Okay, so maybe the lipid hypothesis isn't true. So what? What could possibly be wrong with cutting back on saturated fat and getting your cholesterol as low as possible?
We now have this terrible phobia of fat, of animal fat, which the body needs to be normal, to be healthy.
Your immune system is fat dependent. I mean, your brain is fat dependent. Your skin, your hair, your nails, all these things are fat dependent. Your sex hormones are fat dependent, are cholesterol dependent. They're made sort of on a cholesterol molecule.
If you are elderly, over the age of 60, and if you're a woman of any age, the cholesterol is a complete non-issue. In fact, the higher your cholesterol, the longer you live. And this shows up in study after study.
And yet, in spite of those studies, drugs that lower cholesterol are being marketed to women. But take a good look at that little disclaimer. If it doesn't prevent heart disease, why on earth would you take such a powerful drug?
There is absolutely no benefit for women of any age in taking statins. I mean, statins are a waste of money for women.
There's some real problems with taking statins. Memory loss, muscle problems, and osteoporosis in women. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that you wouldn't want to take statin drugs.
And low cholesterol is a predictor for depression, suicide, violent behavior, strokes, and cancer. It's much better to have high cholesterol than lower cholesterol.
Like most people, I love the taste of fat. Human beings can't live without protein, and in nature, protein is usually surrounded with fat. Maybe Mother Nature actually knew what she was doing. Maybe there's a reason low-fat diets always made me feel depressed.
The brain is basically made of fat. They say you're a fathead, they were not kidding. And when you go on a diet that eliminates most fat, takes you down to say 10% of fat, you have basically robbed the body of the raw materials that are necessary for it to be happy.
There's probably no coincidence that back a couple of decades ago when the low-fat diet was the real rage, if you went to bookstores, what you saw is all these books on low-fat diet, and you saw all these books on depression because everybody was depressed.
Go on a shopping trip at your local natural food store and you'll find the shelves jam-packed with processed vegetable oils. But what exactly is natural about them? Would human beings living in the wild ever consume oils that came from soybeans or corn?
We've never had these in the human diet in the history of the world.
Where do you get fat from corn? If you take corn and put it in a thing and squeeze it, you don't get corn fat out of it. You don't get corn oil. You've got to chemically extract the oil from corn to get it.
Until that process was developed, you didn't have all of these vegetable, soybean oil and corn oil and cottonseed oil and all these things. Humans didn't eat that stuff.
The studies that came in on the corn oil showed that it was a disaster, that it caused cancer. If you gave carcinogens to rats who were fed corn oil, they developed cancer. If the rats were fed coconut oil or tallow, they didn't get cancer.
And it's not just cancer. After the experts convinced millions of Americans to switch from butter and lard to margarine and vegetable oils, heart disease went up. How can that be? After all, vegetable oils are cholesterol-free.
We as humans are not used to eating those fats in the quantities that we've been eating them. I mean, that's what's called an omega-6 fat. Omega-6 fats are pro-inflammatory. They cause inflammation. We need some of them, but we don't need a whole lot of them.
But we do eat a whole lot of them, and those unnatural fats can cause the inflammation that leads to heart disease, especially the most unnatural fat of all. Partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, otherwise known as trans fats.
It gives you the cooking properties you need, the flakiness in biscuits and the chewiness in bread and the things that you look for from a saturated fat. but it doesn't behave as a saturated fat in the body, and the body actually will take it up very readily and pack it into the cell membranes, which then become stiff and inflexible and can't do their job.
Sugar, sugar makes me want to be with you. When I see you, my dreams come true.
The rise in heart disease, and especially the rise in obesity and diabetes, is very clearly about one thing. It's about carbohydrate.
That's the big problem that all these low-fat people have had with a low-fat diet, because a low-fat diet is a high-carbohydrate diet. Okay, I mean, because you got to eat something, and fat and carbohydrate are kind of inversely proportional. When one goes down, the other goes up.
Which is exactly what the experts told us to do. The USDA Food Pyramid recommends a low-fat diet that includes up to 11 servings per day of grains.
To be based on grains is not the native diet for any mammal. There's only one group of animals that lives well on grains, and that's birds.
You know, the USDA Food Pyramid is more about selling agricultural products than it is about selling health.
They're totally committed to what can be sold in the commodity markets. So that's wheat, corn, soybeans, sugar.
A few years ago, I went back and pulled some labels off of feed sacks in a farmer's co-op and ran them through my little nutritional computer. I mean, there's virtually no difference in the macronutrient composition that farmers use to feed animals to fatten them up, and that the USDA uses to tell us how to supposedly slim down.
In the 1990s, the Food and Drug Administration decided it was time to help us slim down. So they ordered food manufacturers to adopt a standardized nutrition label that includes recommended servings of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. FDA Commissioner David Kessler said it was the most important battle for public health he'd ever waged. Stories in the media were full of happy predictions about how much smarter Americans were going to eat, thanks to all that good government advice. And since then, well, maybe we're not following those guidelines. Or maybe we are. The nutrition label the FDA made everybody adopt recommends 300 carbohydrates per day on a 2,000-calorie diet. If you ate 4 cups of broccoli, 3 cups of spinach, 2 cups of peas, 5 carrots, and 2 apples, you would consume about 100 grams of carbohydrate. So how do you get to 300?
It would take a lot of cauliflower and broccoli and cabbage and those kind of things to ever get you to 300 grams of carbohydrate. You can do it with starch.
You can do it with, with potatoes, which are basically a pure starch. You can do it without a whole lot of corn or rice, but those are really starchy foods. And the starch in those breaks down in the GI tract basically to sugar.
The speed at which a particular food raises your blood sugar is measured by something known as the glycemic index. Table sugar has a glycemic index of 64. Coca-Cola has a glycemic index of 63. The foods we ate for millions of years almost all had a low glycemic index. So what about all those whole grains the experts tell us should be the foundation of a healthy human diet? Raisin Bran has a glycemic index of 61. Shredded wheat logs in at 67, which means it spikes your blood sugar faster than sugar does. And depending on the brand, whole wheat bread raises the bar to around 70.
Sugar.
So whether they intended to or not, the FDA and USDA are telling you to load up on sugar. And lots of it.
The amount of blood sugar in your blood, if you have a normal blood sugar, is a little bit less than 1 teaspoon. 300 grams of carb that comes as potato or pasta, even if it's whole grain pasta or whole grain bread, that converts to a cup and a half of sugar. If you were to put a cup and a half of sugar directly into your blood, you'd be dead. Your blood sugar would go sky high.
Since high blood sugar can kill you, your body has to bring it down. And that's how metabolic syndrome begins. Most of us think we only put fat in our fat cells when we eat too much. But as Gary Taubes explains in Good Calories, Bad Calories, your fat cells are like rechargeable fuel cells. Every time you eat, you store some fat. In between meals, fat comes out of your fat cells to provide the fuel for your muscles and organs. If you're naturally thin, it's because you have efficient fat cells. Fat goes in quickly and it comes out easily. Your body doesn't need much fat because the little bit of fat you do have is a reliable source of fuel. If you're predisposed to be fat, it's because you have greedy fat cells. When you eat, you tend to store calories as fat instead of burning them. And when your other tissues need those calories, the fat comes out slowly if it comes out at all.
What are they doing? Did one of you guys forget to pay the food bill? Are you going to eat all that?
The end user of food that we eat are our individual cells. And it doesn't matter if it goes in our mouth. If it doesn't get to those cells, we starve. We starve at the cellular level.
And so you do exactly what your body is telling you to do.
Come on, eat something. A steak, will ya?
You eat more. In other words, you're not getting fat because you're eating more. You're eating more because you're getting fat. Remember, Mother Nature isn't stupid. If your fat cells are slow to release their fuel, your body actually works to make them bigger. And they keep on getting bigger until they can release the energy that your body needs. That could mean gaining a little weight, or it could mean gaining a lot. It all depends on how slowly your fat cells release their fat. Most of us weren't born with greedy fat cells, but we can certainly make them that way. When you eat too many carbohydrates, you raise your blood sugar. Since high blood sugar is toxic, your body releases insulin to bring it down. But your body can only burn a little bit of sugar at a time. So what happens to the rest of it?
Your storage sites for carbohydrate are limited, and we've got unlimited storage places for fat, so the body ends up just converting the carbohydrate to fat.
And after bringing down your blood sugar, insulin does its other job. It tells your body to store fat.
Insulin stimulates an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase that sends fat into the fat cells. So if insulin is elevated, this lipoprotein lipase is really activated and it's sending fat like crazy into the fat cell. So if you eat a lot of carbohydrates, your insulin goes up, you're storing fat in the fat cell.
When you have a healthy metabolism, it only takes a little bit of insulin to bring your blood sugar down, and then everything goes back to normal. But over time, that can change.
Cells can become resistant to the effects of insulin. In essence, when that happens, the insulin's talking, but the cells just aren't listening. And so they don't get the message from insulin, so they don't do what they're supposed to do.
Hello? Stop hitting me. I'm not hitting you. Stop hitting me. I'm not hitting you.
And so your body does what it has to do. It starts producing more insulin.
You finally reach the point to where your insulin's high just to keep your sugar normal, even if you're not eating any sugar. And then when that happens, then it's starting to drive stuff into the fat cell, and then you've reached this point where all of a sudden, bam, you get fat.
And you get fat even though you're eating the same number of calories you always did, because now you have greedy fat cells. So you do what the experts have always told us to do. You go on a low-fat, low-calorie diet so you can burn your own body fat for fuel. Just one little problem. If too many carbohydrates are keeping your insulin high, the insulin is telling your body to store the fat instead of burning it. Now you're really starving inside.
You all out of yourself going, come on, you big pig, give me some of that food. What's the matter with you? I'm hungry down here.
So once again, your body does what it has to do. It slows down your metabolism. You stop losing weight. You get tired, and then you do things like drive around the parking lot looking for a close parking space.
So, so many of my patients come in following that advice where they say, well, I know it can't be about my diet because I'm eating a good diet. And I say, well, what did you have for breakfast this morning? And they say, well, I ate a bowl of Special K, and I used low-fat milk. And then I had 2 pieces of whole wheat toast. And to break your fast in the morning with all of that insulin-producing high glycemic diet is going to shut down your metabolism and is the prescription for making you fat.
And then they end up being, in most cases, larger than they were when they started out, but with a lower metabolic rate.
And it frustrates so many people because they do it and they fail and then they think they failed. And they didn't fail. The diet failed.
The next time you feel like indulging in the usual prejudice against fat people, here's something to keep in mind. My wife has always been thin, and she's the first to admit it has nothing to do with discipline. When she and I sit down for a meal, we both do exactly the same thing. We eat until we're not hungry anymore. I got fat and stayed fat because I was living on foods that told my body to store the calories in my fat cells, which just made me hungrier. In some people, the fat cells and the other tissues become insulin resistant at about the same rate. The good news is they don't gain weight. The bad news is insulin resistance can kill you even if you're skinny.
Demanding of your pancreas that it produce ever greater amounts of insulin to keep your blood sugar normal is ultimately going to cause what's called beta cell burnout. Finally, the pancreas is producing all it can produce, and that's not enough anymore. And when that happens, the beta cells get damaged, they can't produce anymore, and your blood sugar goes up, and now you've become frankly diabetic.
And once your blood sugar goes out of control, it can damage your arteries and lead to heart disease. And yet the experts keep telling us to stay away from fat and load up on carbohydrates. On their website, CSPI encourages parents to cut the fat from their kids' diets and feed them starchy foods like whole wheat crackers and grape nuts.
Grape nuts have a glycemic index of 64.
Sugar.
Which make them more fattening. If you were to eat a bowl of grape nuts, the calories are about the same as eating an extra large Snickers bar.
Sugar.
We were all subjects in a giant experiment, the hypothesis of which was that fat is bad for us. And now here we all are at the end of this giant experiment. Type 2 diabetes is at a screamingly high rate. Way more people are overweight than used to be.
Grandmother could tell you that that diet would make you fat. She knew that potatoes and bread were fattening. We all knew it until modern nutrition told us otherwise.